Without further ado, Andrew McAfee, Erik Brynjolfsson, and Allison Griswold.
So thank you all for coming. Why don't you start by telling us a little about your book?
Okay, I guess we'll dive right in.
You start.
The book is called Machine Platform Crowd, and it's available for sale.
And we will drive down the resale value of it by signing it for you afterward.
Exactly. So it's about three great rebalancings. Mind and machine, product and platform, core and crowd. We couldn't fit all those words on the cover, so we just used the last three. And that's the direction that the world is changing right now. Not all the way, but part way, from decision-making moving more from human minds towards machines, both data-driven decision-making and especially artificial intelligence, moving from products towards platforms like the 5 most valuable companies on the planet, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, and moving from the core to the crowd, the core being the people at the center of a company or organization that traditionally have made most of the important decisions, towards the crowd, which is people outside of it, and now can include literally billions of people connected with a digital network in a way they never were before.
And we should tell you a bit about where the book came from, because as we heard during the introduction, Erik and I wrote a book that came out in early 2014 called The Second Machine Age. And it was all about this period of crazy tech progress that we're living through. And as soon as we published it, we noticed this really interesting phenomenon. We'd go to conferences and we'd talk about the book, and then we would have really interesting hallway conversations over and over again. And the same hallway conversation, somebody would come up to us and say essentially, look, I run company X, and I believe the story you're telling. Now what? What do I need to do differently? How do I need to think about my business model, the industry I'm competing in, this world that we're heading into? I know things are changing. I need kind of a guidebook for this. And the more we heard this, the more we realized this was going to be the next book that we were going to work on. The central problem was we didn't know the answer to that question when we first started hearing it over and over. But we turned that bug into a feature and said, look, this is really intellectually rich territory to go out and try to write like a guidebook to this new economy, to this new business world that we're heading into. So we headed out, and our main research approach, in addition to doing what academics are supposed to do, which is read lots of research and digest papers and do all of that, what we do that's a little bit different and that's much more fun is we go out and talk to the alpha geeks. This is a term we learned from our friend Tim O'Reilly. These are the people who are inventing the future. Their companies and their organizations are changing things quickly. So we went off and hit the road and talked to them a lot. And then what our homework, we think, was to try to distill down what they were saying and come up with some kind of framework or a way to think about the changes that are happening so quickly. And that's where Erik's, the three-part structure that Erik just described came from. We kind of heard that machines were getting just ridiculously more powerful. We couldn't leave out the artificial intelligence and machine learning revolution. We kept on seeing these weird companies appear and disrupt industry after industry, and they all look like platforms to us. And we kept on seeing these examples of companies and individuals and things like Linux and Wikipedia that were activating the energy of huge numbers of very diverse people all around the world. The crowd was clearly a really powerful phenomenon. So that led to the three-part structure that's in the book.
So I think one of the anecdotes that comes up a lot on these topics, in which you have early in your book, is about Alphago. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of a good way. Who here is familiar with the Alphago story?
We see, yeah, how much?
Yeah, a lot of people.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, for those who aren't, do you guys want to explain what happened?
Sure. Alphago is an example of a machine learning algorithm that was trained to play the game of Go. The ancient game of Go, it's sort of a little board game, but it turns out to be vastly more complicated than, say, chess, which was beat by humans by machines back in 1997. It's been calculated that there are more possible moves in a game of Go than there are atoms in the universe. And that means the traditional programming techniques of trying to search exhaustively even a tiny fraction of the moves is completely infeasible. And for that reason, as recently as 2015, computer scientists were surveyed and asked when they thought machines would be able to beat humans at the game of Go. And they predicted probably around 2027. That was the median estimate.
And these were insiders. They polled artificial intelligence experts and asked this question.
But as some of you in the audience know, a machine did beat the world champion in Go just last year, and they did it by using this new technique, not of trying to exhaustively search the moves, but by looking at the board and seeing patterns in it. And that's the way humans do it. Humans, when they play the game of Go, they don't even know how they do it. If you ask them, how do you play Go? They can't explain it. They just say, I look at the board and I see a move that seems right, but I can't explain how. I can't describe the strategy. I can't tell you exactly what I'm doing. And you can imagine, if they can't explain it, how are you going to program it? How are you going to code it? But this new approach to machine learning, where the machines look at lots and lots of examples of successes and failures, the machines can figure out the patterns on their own. And by applying this technique called deep neural nets and reinforcement learning, the machines were able to very rapidly learn the game of Go to the level where they could beat the humans at the game of Go. And now the human champions, when they see what the machines are doing, they say, you know, we have not even touched the edge of the game of Go. We have been studying this for 3,000 years, but the machines are so far ahead of us, we realize that we have no conception of what is possible.
And the reason Erik and I think that we are still underestimating the impact and the power of machine learning, despite the fact that we all read about it in the press all the time, is exactly what he just said, that here is a domain of intense human study for 3 millennia, for 3,000 years. We built up this body of what we thought was really exhaustive knowledge about how to play this game. This piece of machine learning technology comes out of nowhere and shows us how much more headroom there is in this particular domain. That's pretty amazing. And when we think about all of the other incredibly complex things that we're trying to get good at, whether that is solving the mysteries of cancer, whether that is unlocking the secrets of protein folding, whether that is figuring out what to invest in, whether that is dealing with the silly complexity of the human genome, we now have a colleague for that work, and a colleague that can not be limited by the knowledge that we humans possess right now might be able to show us some ways forward.
And this last point is really the key one, and one of the reasons sometimes we call it the second wave of the second machine age. The second machine age is this idea that machines start doing mental tasks the way that in the first machine age they started doing physical tasks. But the way for the past few decades that we've taught machines to do mental tasks is we've programmed them. We've codified our own knowledge and encoded it so that the machines could do it. That tell them how to do tax preparation or how to do a spreadsheet. It's all stuff that we already knew exactly what needed to be done, and we just had to be very, very, very precise, and the machine would do the same thing. That's great. I mean, that generated trillions of dollars worth of value, so that's great. But there are so many problems that it sounds paradoxical, but that we don't really know how to do them. Like, I wouldn't know how to code how to recognize my mother's face or how to ride a bicycle. These are things we just know how to do intuitively, but we can't explain them. And so we know more than we can tell. With the machine learning that we just described, we now have opened up those possibilities. These machines are learning on their own how to solve those problems, not by having the humans teach them painstakingly step by step, but instead by giving them examples of what works and doesn't work. This is a cat, this is a dog, this is a human face, this is the word yes or no in French or in English, and the machines, if you give them enough examples, will figure out the patterns on their own. It's really a remarkable transition that has really become important only in the past few years, mostly really since we wrote the last book, The Second Machine Age.
There was an example that went viral on Twitter a while back. It was, could the machine tell whether it's a blueberry muffin or a dog? Because it had the little dots on its face. But one thing I love about the
There was another one that came out at the same time. There was the Labradoodle or the Kentucky Fried Chicken. And it's actually surprisingly hard to tell the difference. At a quick glance, I was like dog, dog, chicken, dog, and not getting it right all the time.
This is one of these stories that really works better if you look at the picture. So I encourage you all to Google, because right now you don't really see like that someone would accidentally bite into a piece of Labradoodle. But if you see the pictures, they can be hard to tell apart, but we humans can often do it. And what's really remarkable is that 7 years ago, machines had about a 30% error rate on a big database called ImageNet. And that was using the best techniques. Now the error rate is down lower than 5%, which importantly is less than the error rate of humans on that same data set. So we've kind of crossed an inflection point. It's not just a matter of degree, but it's just like when you raise the temperature of water past the boiling point, it's a fundamental transformation. If a machine can do a task better than a human, then if you're an entrepreneur or a manager and you have to make a decision, who do I assign this task? You're going to pick the one that can do the job better.
Well, so one thing I was hoping we could talk about is this idea that in the future, or even now, people will be learning from machines in addition to teaching them. And one thing I like about the Alphago story is that after the world champion was defeated, he said, so beautiful about the moves. Because it wasn't something he'd ever conceptualized before, and that's something that we could see in a lot of fields.
And we're seeing it over and over, and you're exactly right about people learning side by side with machines. You're talking about Lee Sedol, who was the Korean guy that got beat last spring by Alphago in a very, very widely televised match. It's part of the reason that there was a downward blip in the Korean economy for a while. So everyone stopped what they were doing. This is a big deal. Two, we think, really important things happened along the lines of your question. One was that Sedol was beating about 75% of his top-level human opponents before he played Alphago. After he got done playing Alphago and dealt with that technology for a while, he was beating about 90% of his human opponents. So he made a big quantum leap upward in his game. Already a very high level, made a quantum leap upward. The other thing that happened is that sales of Go boards in Korea and throughout Asia skyrocketed. And little kids started playing the games in much, much higher volume than they were before. So Allison, one thing we hear once in a while is, oh my heavens, isn't it terrible that we're no longer the best at this particular activity, and doesn't that reduce human value or dignity? I think that's dead flat wrong. Because if we define ourselves by the things that we're best in the universe at, that's a pretty silly thing to do. We now have this neat thing happening out there that people want to be part of. If technology is part of that neat thing, I think that's good.
What do you think?
I think it's good. And let me underscore one of the points that Andy made. Lee Sedol got a lot better. Why? Because he played a bunch of games against this machine? No, that wasn't it. It's because this machine came at the game from a fundamentally different way.
Right.
When they saw some of the moves that the machine made, the Go experts had, at first they said, oh my God, that is idiotic.
Yeah, there's a bug here.
That's a disastrous way. Every beginner knows not to do what the machine just did. And then a few moves later, guess what? The machine won, and they're like, oh, I see what he did there. That is really innovative. And so for 3,000 years, humans have been learning from other humans. They've been learning from their masters. If they made that move that the machine made, their master would slap their wrist and say, stupid human, don't do that. But the machine came at it with fresh perspective. They have a different way of thinking, if you want to call it that. And they came up with some innovative approaches. And it's not just true in the game of Go, it's true in all kinds of problems. The machines aren't just better in certain ways, but more importantly, perhaps, they're different in certain ways, and they come at it with a different perspective. And that opens up the possibility that humans and machines can work together and help each other, because they're not just two clones of the same thing. They're two different kinds of intelligence.
And what's cool about that story, lots of things are cool. One of the things that's cool is that you probably needed to be a player somewhere near the level of Lee Sedol to even get the insight about why Alphago made the move that it did. You needed to be really good at this domain to start to unpack why the machine was behaving in this way. Because the machine was kind of mute about why it was doing what it was doing. We need really high-level humans to look at that and say, I think I know what's going on here. Let's go test that idea.
So where are some companies, parts of the economy that we're already seeing this? Instead of a replacement of people with machines, we're seeing like a mutual collaboration in learning.
So let me describe one. It's not in the book. It's something we learned afterwards, but it's very much in the spirit of the book. So one of our friends, Sebastian Thrun, runs a company called Udacity. Anybody here know the company Udacity? A bunch of people. Yeah, it's like an online learning course. Company that has a bunch of courses. You can learn different things in 90 days, these nano degrees. So people come to their website and they have a chat with sales reps saying, is this course right for me? Is that one? What should I be doing?
Human sales reps, not sales bots.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. The story gets more interesting.
Wait, stay tuned.
Stay tuned. So when they come, the human sales reps, some of them are better than others, and some of them are able to answer the questions effectively, convert the people, convince them that, hey, this is a good course for you to take. Others, not so much. Well, Sebastian Thrun is a machine learning expert, and along with the grad student, they recognize if you take the transcripts of all these chats, that becomes the data for what's called supervised learning. Basically, supervised learning is giving examples of successes and failures to a machine and letting the machine figure out what matters. So they gave these transcripts, and their machine learning algorithm started seeing patterns that the successful sales reps had different ways of answering questions. At that point, they did not turn it over to the bot to the answers, because there's still too many unstructured questions that the machine would just be clueless at. But there is sort of an 80-20 rule. There's certain very common questions that account for a big percentage of the queries. And what they did was they still had the humans doing the interactions with their incoming traffic, but the bot would kind of watch them. And when one of these common phrases, common questions came up, the bot would kind of prompt and say, you know, here's a phrase you might consider using. It's worked really well in the past. And then the humans would pick up on that. And especially the not so good sales reps saw their performance improve dramatically. And overall, the sales closing rate went up by about 50%. So it was a tremendous improvement. But part of it was the ability to combine the humans and machines in a way that neither one of them would have been successful on their own.
And we should be clear, in some cases we are going to automate work and just flat give it from minds over to machines, and that's the appropriate thing to do. But it's naive to think that that's the unidirectional, the only force going on. We love that story because it shows a real fans of technology and automation realizing they still needed humans involved in this process, but we could kind of amplify their abilities or turbocharge their abilities with a lot of smart technology in the background.
And the broader lesson that's going to apply to machines, platforms, and crowds is that each of those pairs of words, we're not saying turn the dial all the way to one extreme. Instead, we're saying you got to think about the balance there. Sometimes it makes sense to fully automate or go totally platform or go totally crowd, but in most cases you need to find a balance there. And the balance is more towards machines, platforms, and crowds than I think most companies or individuals realize, but it's not as simple as just chuck the first part of the words.
So this question comes up a lot, but what do you see as areas that are most resistant to the advent of machines and computers? Like we were talking earlier about, there's a part in your book where you mention this famous saying by Andrew Bird. Would you like to quote it?
Yeah, Andrew Bird is a lyricist, and he said a while back that the only thing that the only difference between a completely unlinked series of observations and a hit song is excessive confidence on the part of the songwriter. And I think that's just a lovely way to look at it, but he's lowballing himself really badly, because it would be trivially easy to program a computer to spit out observations that might rhyme and that might have words associated with love and loss in them. You could program that computer pretty easily. We are incredibly confident that the lyrics would be probably drivel, would probably not make a lot of sense, and would not activate any emotions on the part of the rest of us. And what I believe great writers, what great human lyricists do, is they have those barely linked observations, but in a way that resonates with other human beings. And that is a skill that we have not seen computers come up with yet. There's a concept from linguistics that I find incredibly helpful here. And the concept is called the intuition of the native speaker. And what that means is if I look at almost any length or any complexity sentence in English, I can immediately tell if it's grammatically correct or not. Before my brain has processed its meaning, before I know what it's trying to convey, my brain goes, yeah, that's kosher or not. I speak some French, I can't do that in French to save my life. English as a second language speakers can't do that anywhere near well as I can or any other native speaker can. The reason I bring that up is I believe we humans have the native speaker's intuition about the human condition, about the social world that we've created, about the physical world that we move through. Trying to teach computers to have that native intuition, man, if we ever do that, I believe that is decades away. In the same way, they're just second language speakers about this world that we've created. So I have a lot of confidence that the human ability to evoke an emotional response via words and language, man, if that gets automated quickly, I'm actually going to be surprised.
But at the same time, we also have algorithms that are starting to compose music.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell apart from the music of famous composers. So
not hard. actually impossible
Right.
in a fair test.
So the interesting question is, what is the difference between music
Yeah.
and lyrics?
Yeah.
And what about that makes it automatable and not automatable?
And this is getting far away from our area, my area of expertise. I'm not a musicologist, but the aesthetics of music are kind of well known. In Western music, we know what chord progressions sound good to our ears and which ones sound like sirens clanging on a New York street, right? And we want to do more of the former and less of the latter. So you can encode that stuff. And you know the rules of a fugue, you know the rules of a reel, you know these kinds of things. So it's relatively easy to hit the button and spin those things out.
I think it goes beyond that, and that's part of it. But the machines that are doing a really good job in music, they're not necessarily encoded with the rules of a fugue or the code or the chords, but there are patterns that emerge. Yeah. And you don't have to know anything about the deep structure or meaning of the music. You see these patterns, and machines are actually quite good at these more sort of shallow pattern matching recognition. But for the lyrics to really be evocative, you need to understand the meaning. It's not just that two words often appear next to each other in sequence. If you really want to go beyond that, you need to understand something about the human condition. And the machines, although they can recognize patterns in words, pairs or triples, they still do not really understand what the word's doing. A machine can translate one language to another, but they're not actually understanding what's going on there. And that's very different. Similarly, machines can be very good at certain kinds of video games that are sort of quick reaction shooter video games. You shoot the missile and it hits the Space Invader. Great at that. But if the game involves some kind of deeper planning and structure, they're hopeless at that. And I think language is a little bit more like the complicated video games. Yeah. And music is more like the pattern matching.
Mm-hmm.
We included in the book an excerpt from a machine learning system that got trained on Jane Austen novels and then generated some Jane Austen-ish prose. It's not even that it's gibberish. It actively makes your head hurt to try. It's bizarrely unpleasant to read. So unless we can make that go 180 degrees different, I'm with Erik. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Well, so the patterns thing is an interesting point because it's often said when you look at jobs and what jobs are most likely to become automated, that it's not, the divide isn't high skill, low skill so much as repeatable and high frequency tasks versus variable, unpredictable tasks. And those are...
That's a good way of it. I mean, the broader lesson here is that machines are not just good, they're superhuman at certain types of tasks. They've been superhuman at arithmetic for decades, so we shouldn't be surprised. And now they're getting superhuman at certain kinds of pattern recognition. And if things are repeatable, as you say, you're going to be able to get the data to be able to train a system. If they involve more complex planning, creativity, those are things that are much harder to have a machine learn, at least with our current wave of artificial intelligence. And one thing we want to stress is we're talking about what's available circa 2017. There's a bunch of very, very bright people working on all sorts of things that may be breakthroughs in 2018 or 2080. We're not sure. They haven't happened yet. But based on current technology, these matching, basically taking a bunch of inputs X and mapping them into a bunch of outputs Y and figuring out the mapping for that, they're really, really good at that if there's not too much complexity between the X's and the Y's.
And I even think that framework, that second one that you brought up, is rapidly becoming out of date because I never would have thought of medical diagnosis as any kind of routine, repeatable, low-level kind of work that you would hand off to a machine. It's an incredibly important and difficult and subtle and complex pattern matching exercise, right? Machines are better at those things than we are now, and they've come out of essentially nowhere and reached superhuman levels of performance. So I think that medical diagnosis is squarely in the sights of a very highly automatable task, and one that we should apply a lot more machines to. That did not appear to be the case 5 or 10 years ago.
And parts of it have already crossed that threshold. So if you look at image recognition, we talked about recognizing dogs and cats or recognizing faces. But guess what? You can also apply it to medical images. Here's a picture of a lung. Which one has cancer? Which one doesn't have cancer? Human pathologists and radiologists spend years of training to learn exactly what to look for. You train a machine learning system to do that, and they can very rapidly learn not only all the markers that are taught in medical school, but a number of new markers that no humans had ever noticed before.
Yeah.
And so what is the accuracy comparison? I mean, you also talk in your book about how machines are rapidly eclipsing human experts in their own subjects.
Well, this is a number that's changing as we speak. And even since we finished that book, there's been significant improvements. There's an article published in Nature in February of this year. That example I gave of going from 30% to 5% on image recognition was an example from May. In voice recognition, understanding speech, it went from 8.5% error rate to 4.9% error rate. But what's really striking is not just the improvement, but that improvement was done over the past, not 10 years, but past 10 months, since July of, actually 11 months, yeah, since July of 2016. So we're getting these, I mean, as we speak, they're improving it more and more. And a lot of it just comes from taking broadly the same set of algorithms, but A, a lot more data, a lot more examples, and B, a lot more computational power.
And with medicine, the studies that we've come across are kind of conservative. They want to be circumspect about these things. But they generally say that a properly done machine learning system will be at human level performance, even experienced diagnostician performance. I think that's probably lowballing it. I think they're better than the average doctor in a lot of cases today.
So where are most people going to first really encounter this kind of technology? I mean, is it Alexa, right? Is it Alexa saying, buy me Whole Foods?
Yeah, no.
Okay, Jeff. Okay, Jeff, buying Whole Foods.
Exactly. You do get those kinds of errors. And but I think, yeah, a lot of it, one example is voice recognition, and that's improved a lot. And you know, it's clearly not perfect yet. It still makes those kinds of errors, some that you just described, but it's been measurably better to the point where I now dictate rather than type a lot of the text that I write. And there's a study out of Stanford that dictating as opposed to typing is about 3 times faster and more accurate for the set of applications they looked at. But we've been encountering some of them that, you know, it's kind of sad, but probably the leading example, the one that's been most obviously profitable, some of the other ones may be secret, has been deciding what ads to serve up next to your searches. And if they can figure out what you're likely to click on versus what you're not likely to click on, that is worth billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. And one of the things that's driven some of the algorithmic improvements. So that's one that we actually encounter quite a bit.
And that seems a little sad that we're throwing all of this brain power and all of this computing power at ad placement. However, the insights that we get from that are being translated over into all kinds of other domains. So the main way that we're coming across these cutting edge technologies is via devices like these, like Erik says. Speaking into them, having them understand what we want, getting decent quality translations, type in a few letters, it figures out the rest of what you're looking for and gives it to you. You know, these are all flavors of artificial intelligence.
Or you may have noticed, those of you who use Facebook, along with about 2 billion other people as of yesterday, that it will offer to label the names of the faces of your friends there. It recognizes who they are using exactly these technologies we've been talking about. That's something it couldn't do just a couple of years ago.
So what is the line between these things being helpful and creepy? Because just me personally, when Facebook offers to label my friends in pictures, I find that creepy.
The first time that somebody else tagged me in a photo and put that up on Facebook was years ago. I found that deeply creepy.
You mean another human?
Another human did that. So creepy is a creeping boundary. And I think creepy turns into familiar very, very quickly. The analogy that I use is when I was learning to scuba dive, the very first breath I took underwater was abjectly terrifying to me. You're not supposed to breathe underwater. The second one was kind of weird, and then after that it's like, I'm just underwater.
You know, there's that classic Arthur C. Clarke saying that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And maybe that is a little bit creepy. But I think that the companies that are pushing them out need to think a little bit about how people are going to react. And there are certainly examples where they cross that line and
they activate the ick factor.
They reveal that they know more about you than maybe you wish they knew. And by not exposing that, they still know it, but then they're not letting you know. And that's one of the things I think maybe we have to think a little bit about is what can these machine learning algorithms infer about us from our behavior, from who our friends are, from our social networks, from where our iPhone or Android phone has been. All these things are providing data to machine learning algorithms, and whether we know it or not, or whether we like it or not, they can potentially be used to infer things about us.
Well, and then on the other end of sort of public awareness, there's like the whole self-driving car issue, right? Where there's a concern that some companies are moving too quickly with self-driving car technology. It's going to cause an accident, which
It has caused an accident.
Has caused an accident, will cause more deaths, will cause regulators to just clamp down the whole program.
So we have a view on this, which is that self-driving cars are not going to be perfect, certainly not anytime soon. And there will be deaths, there have been deaths, but the right standard isn't, or at least shouldn't be, perfection. As you guys may know, there are about 30,000 highway deaths per year with human drivers. So even if self-driving cars were, say, 90% better, that would be 3,000 deaths. And to me, as a cold-hearted economist, I would say, well, that's an improvement. We've saved 27,000 lives. But the reality is that those self-driving car manufacturers are probably not going to get 27,000 thank you letters. They're going to get 3,000 lawyer subpoenas for the people.
More than 3,000.
Yeah, maybe more. But this is something that I think we have to. It's back to these cultural changes that Andy and I were just talking about. We have to think about what our expectations are for the machines and how we'd like to where we'd like to set that threshold.
And Erik and I have been in a couple different self-driving cars, and that was another one of those.
And live to tell the tale.
Live to tell the tale. And it was another one of those scuba diving moments. The first minutes of autonomous driving are terrifying, because this is not an abstract thing. You are hurtling. We were on a highway going down 101. The car was doing 60 plus, and nobody was driving the dang thing.
It was going 55.
They had a little dial there. This was initially not cool at all.
Yeah.
And then it turned into extraordinarily cool, and then it turned into kind of boring, because the car was going down the highway, obeying all relevant statutes.
It was going 55,
and braking correctly. Like it was an amazingly boring experience.
I was in one of Uber's self-driving cars in Pittsburgh, and mine was basically fine. Like the whole trip, there were a couple like abrupt accelerations, but otherwise fine. The New York Times reporter, his car, when they let him drive it, didn't start. So he got the best lead for his story.
Oh, you had to write a boring,
I wrote a boring story about this car was fine, the experience was fine. I'm in my car, I press the start button, it won't turn on. Yeah.
But this is actually really important. This whole question about autonomy as an aspect of turning things over to machines is a very important question. We need to keep in mind, technology right now is increasing highway fatalities. Distracted driving deaths are going up in America. Road deaths have been going down.
Not the self-driving technology.
Not the self-driving. Like us driving it going like this. This is the worst of all possible combinations.
The texting technology.
Yeah, my view is, for heaven's sake, let's bring forward the day we can just turn this over to the machines. They will do a demonstrably better job. And think about how that'll open up life to the elderly, the blind, the disabled, the infirm, people like that. Why would we hold this technology back from those groups?
One of my favorite self-driving car mental exercises is what happens if you have a self-driving car coming down the road and someone just decides to walk into the road and just stand there. How does the car negotiate that?
The car will stop.
Right. So does the pedestrian have like a newborn kind of power?
Yeah, yes.
Because the car will just stop.
We've been driving the streets of New York. Pedestrians here believe they have a great deal of power. We don't think the power imbalance is a huge issue.
Yeah. Well, so there are two things. One, just to give you an example of the progress, the early stage cameras in those cars, as they were testing before they mobilized them, were able to recognize pedestrians and made about an error once per 30 frames. That's about once per second. That's really not usable. Now it's about 1 per 30 million in the latest mobilized systems. So that is a huge, just gives you a sense of how much better the system's got, about 1 millionfold. But you're right, one of the things, in fact, this is one of the reasons we wrote this book, is that it's not necessarily the technology that is kind of the most interesting thing. It's how our norms and expectations will change. And you're absolutely right. If a human encounters a self-driving car, the car is going to be trained to stop without question. It's not going to play chicken with the human. And humans, some humans may take advantage of that. I've heard people saying, well, they're going to start bullying the self-driving cars and, faking like they're going to go in front of it and making the car flinch. So I don't know. There may be some people who start doing that, and we may have to think a little bit about how we update our norms and our expectations. Just like with social media and with email, things like fake news and other things have emerged that weren't necessarily expected by the inventors of those technologies. So there's a constant evolution of our business processes, our norms, our expectations to use these technologies in ways that are effective as opposed to destructive.
And fake news is actually a great example. Fake news is a product of our minds. It is amplified by our minds. And it brings up that great quote, Eric and I were arguing about who said it first, that a lie is halfway around the world while the truth is still getting its boots on. We have a colleague back at MIT named Sanan Aral who's about to write a book about how viral fake news is. It's incredibly viral. That quote is actually really accurate. So what do we do about that? Can you convince people to stop generating fake news and trying to pass it on? I believe you probably can't do that. But can the great social media platforms tweak their algorithms and use machine learning, for example, to deliberately damp down the bouncing around of those particular signals? They could easily do that. Would our society be better served by that? I believe it would. So I hope they do those kinds of experiments. And if people who really love propagating fake news are unhappy about that, they can take their nonsense elsewhere.
Well, and so one of the questions that you raise in your book is sort of about the supposed neutrality of algorithms, right? Like no algorithm is unbiased because algorithms are created by humans at some point. And so how do you reconcile those things?
So let me nuance what you said a little bit. It's usually not so much the algorithm that is unbiased. I just used it that way.
That was
evolving language.
That was his natural understanding of the human language.
Yeah, there you go. That's evolving as well. So the issue is the type of data used to train these systems. And that data can be biased, and that can lead to bias. And I wouldn't go as far as saying it's always biased, but they can be biased because the data comes from the real world, often comes from humans. So let me make it a little bit more concrete. If suppose you have an algorithm that's deciding how to make loans, who gets loans and who doesn't, and if you train it based on the human loan decisions and say, here's some examples of people who get loans and people who don't get loans, well, if those humans had some kind of biases, racial, ethnic, gender, or what other biases, then the examples are going to be biased, and the system may learn those biases and embed them into its own decision making. And as a result, you can get a biased algorithm. And this is a genuine problem. It's a concern, A, because it's biased, B, because it's often hard to suss out where that bias comes from. The algorithm is generated on its own. It's not something somebody encoded, and therefore we don't know exactly what's driving it. But, and this is a really important but, we have to remember that humans are biased too. And so as with our self-driving car example, Andy and I I know I can speak for Andy because we've talked about this. We don't think the right standard is necessarily perfection. It's whether or not we can do better than the existing system. And the algorithms have the potential for being improved over time in a way that's often harder to do with reducing or eliminating human biases.
And I want to be clear about my beliefs here. We can beat the baseline with algorithms very easily because the baseline is how are people doing on these decisions. Gang, we are biased as hell. We have all kinds of problems in our mental hardware. Our brains are amazing. They are buggy. They are glitchy. They have a huge number of very well documented biases. Let me give you one example that's in the book and maybe my favorite one. There's a very careful study done that showed that if you were going up for parole in Israel, the single best determinant of whether or not you got parole was the blood sugar level of the judge at the time of day they heard your case. This is a really bad way to make this decision, right? There's no rational basis for defending that, and the judges were completely unaware that they had this bias. Judges are supposed to be neutral, dispassionate people. They were doing a terrible job on this societally important decision. That study, as far as we can tell, was not a fluke. That was a demonstration of really, really pervasive things that we humans, with the best of intentions and with putting our mental energies to work, still get wrong. I'm not going to speak for Eric, although I think we've discussed this enough. I believe it's going to be very easy to have less biased, higher quality decisions in domain after domain after domain with a little bit of data and some smart algorithms.
Okay, let's shift. Let's go to the gig economy. The future of work, outsourcing of jobs, platforms. You start.
it's one of the really important phenomena in the business world, and one of the important phenomena in our workforce is a couple of things are going on. The percentage of Americans who have good old-fashioned, stable W-2 40-hour-a-week health plan benefit jobs, those are still around. The percentage of working people who have a job that looks like that is going down at a pretty steady clip. Technology is probably accelerating the pace at which that situation changes, because we have the rise of the on-demand economy and these very, very powerful, very rapidly growing platforms that connect people who want a service with people who are offering their labor and or their assets to provide that service. We all know about the Uberization of transportation in cities around the world. The conclusion Erik and I came to when we looked around the world and tried to understand this issue, there are many, many more opportunities out there. Entrepreneurs are building platforms to connect all kinds of different networks of people and assets and resources, and we have not yet seen the end of the platformization of the economy.
Yeah, in fact, this is one place where we can learn a lot from outside the United States. In particular, China has an explosion of what's come to be called the O2o economy. Anybody here? How many people here are familiar with that phrase, O2o? So this stands for online to offline. It's the idea that you can have an online device like your phone, and it connects you to a whole set of online services. It's like the Uberization of not just picking up a car or renting a place, but if you need your dog walked or your car washed or any other kinds of service that you may want to be able to have a person come and help you with, you can click a button and it's like a remote control to the world. People will come and take care of it. And it connects you to a burgeoning gig economy or on-demand economy. And it's one of the most rapidly growing phenomena, not just in China, but now something we're bringing back to the United States and lots of other dimensions people are playing around with. We recently talked to Leah Busk, and TaskRabbit is another example of that. But you could see that potentially it leads to a much more fluid kind of labor marketplace, and also capital too. When you think about the use of homes and rooms in Airbnb, that is making capital more efficient. And Uber actually does both. Uber cars can be or Lyft can be a more efficient way of using the capital asset of an automobile. Those of us who have cars, most of them are sitting idle about 95% of the time in a parking lot or a driveway somewhere. Imagine if you increase the utilization by sharing it among lots of people in a service to say 50%, not 100%. That would be a 10 times improvement in the capital utilization of that asset.
One of the weird outcomes of writing this book is that I go home at night in Cambridge and I pass by my car in my driveway and it pisses me off because I've got this big expensive hunk of metal sitting there idle greater than 95% of the time. That didn't used to incense me in the past, and now I just find it this colossal waste. The opportunity that we have is to take the infrastructure that's out there in the world, everything from spare bedrooms to cars to trucking capacity to warehouse capacity, and make it much, much more efficient by having it used more heavily. And you can be underwhelmed by that. Who cares about efficiency? We should all care about efficiency. Efficiency is massively important if we want to tread more lightly on the planet, if we want to make better use of our resources, if we want to stop cooking it over the course of the 20th century. We're not going to walk away from consumption. We had better get more efficient with our use of resources. These phones that we're all carrying around are unparalleled assets for making greater use of the other assets and the other infrastructure out there in the world.
So now that we've introduced this, does anyone have any questions, or should we continue?
We do have questions.
We have lots of questions.
Thank you.
Erik, you asked me to see if I could ask some hard questions.
We'd love that.
Thank you. I'm Mark Stallman. I'm the president of the Center for the Study of Digital Life right here in New York City. We've known each other for a while, and I'm noticing that you kind of have shifted, as you described to begin with. There's a dystopian and a utopian way to view these things. You shifted more towards the utopian side of this, driven by the reasons you have before. I'm going to try to drive you to the other side.
Drive away.
Thank you. You may have seen this past Sunday in the New York Times, Kai-Fu Lee, who I suspect you personally know, wrote a fascinating editorial. Did you happen to see that?
I did.
Great. So what Kai-Fu Lee said, and this is a man who ran serious pieces of Google and Microsoft in China. He's sort of at the top of the Chinese pyramid on these things. He said, we're heading into a situation in which every economy in the world is going to have to decide whether they will become subsidiaries of the United States or the Chinese economy. Because, in fact, these machines are going to require massive welfare transfers. And what he was saying, of course, is that we, the Chinese, will do this better than the US does. So my question to you is, if we head into a world in which we do, in fact, have, again, New York Times today had a headline, robocapocalypse, from a meeting in Portugal. If we do, in fact, go there, how will world leaders deal with such a radical transformation, which, by the way, was the conclusion of your previous book, but is not what we've been talking about today?
So, great question. Thanks for asking about that. It was not the conclusion of our previous book, but we did talk about some of the big changes. So what we talked about was, on one hand, the bounty, which is this wealth, and we've been touching on that so far, the potential for the technology to create a lot more wealth, not just more millionaires and more billionaires, but more GDP per person, lifting a lot of people out of poverty in China and elsewhere. Great news. So that's good news. But we also talked about what we call the spread, which is that for the past 20 plus years, there's been a growing gap between the rich and the poor, growing levels of overall inequality. And while there are many drivers of that, a big part of the reason we said, and we believe, is because of the way that technology has been used. We are neither utopians nor dystopians. We are people who think that we have choices, and none of this is going to happen automatically. If we sit back and wonder whether it's going to be good or bad, that's the wrong attitude. These tools can be used in lots of different ways. Kai-Fu Lee takes, I think, a more extreme position than is warranted by the evidence. We are not in a world without work right now, or on the verge of a world without work. We're in a world of very rapidly transforming work. There's plenty of work to be done, but it's different kinds of work than before. And the result that you see in the data is that many people are having falling wages. About the median wages at 50th percentile are lower than they were 20 years ago, and the people below that have done worse. And there's pressure on those kinds of wages. It's not that there aren't any jobs. In fact, there are more jobs now, people working, than there were ever before in the United States and other countries. But we need to do a better job of lifting the incomes of people on the bottom half of the distribution. I don't see a robo-apocalypse, or whatever the word is, anytime imminent, but I do see the biggest challenge that our society has ever faced over the next 10 years in using these technologies to create more broadly shared prosperity. I am quite convinced that it's possible, and it's possible to create that kind of shared prosperity if we update our policies, our institutions, the way our organizations are run. This is not something that somebody is going to just do to us. It's something that we get to choose. And one of the reasons we wrote the last book and this book was to help provide some guidance on how companies and policymakers and individuals can make that adjustment. And we'd be happy, I've already spoken enough there, be happy to get into some of the details of that. But I want to sort of calibrate a little bit. There is definitely a huge challenge. The biggest challenge that I think that our society faces today is the challenge of how to use these technologies to create shared prosperity. But we shouldn't despair. We shouldn't think there's a robo-apocalypse. This is something we are totally capable of managing. And if we do it right, it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to humanity. But there's no guarantee we're going to do it right.
And we should also be clear on where another challenge is and isn't. It is true that the big tech companies of America and China are large, really impressive, powerful companies in a lot of ways. That is categorically different from saying they're about to take over the global economy. How do we know this? Math tells us this. If you take the total sales of those companies and compare it to the size of the global economy, they vanish. It is a rounding error. And if these companies all grew much faster than their historical growth rates, which are almost unprecedented in history, they would have to grow for decades and decades before they had any meaningful share of the global economy. So there's some heavy breathing going on about, oh my heavens, these big powerful tech companies. We need to calm down about that a little bit. I'm not saying be blasé and just let them do whatever the heck they want to. All great concentrations of power demand vigilance. They also demand a little rationality.
Okay, next question. You.
Hi,
Yep.
Andrew and Erik. Ed McGuire. I have been following your work for several years, and I haven't had a chance to read the book because it just downloaded my Kindle a couple of days ago. But I had really two questions. One is there's a lot of concern about the implications of artificial general intelligence. Ultimately, when computers start to become autonomous, I'd be interested to hear about how you address some of the concerns, the ethical concerns that are emerging about purely autonomous systems and really what needs to be thought. The other question, or the other kind of looking for your thoughts on, is the conflict between centralization and decentralization that's brought by technology. And if you think about things like DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations,
Yeah.
which are a kind of a new concept in the last couple of years that have come out of blockchain and cryptocurrency. How are you looking at how organizations, policymakers, and people who are entrepreneurs who may want to overturn the status quo think about using these technologies responsibly?
The definition of a great question in this context is one that we devoted 2 chapters of the book to. So that is a great question. and we spend the final 2 chapters of the book talking about exactly that second question that you brought up, which is what are the implications of these very, very new technologies that we have for radical decentralization. We've all heard of Bitcoin, right? A lot of us are familiar with blockchain too. Blockchain is the ledger that keeps track of who's got the Bitcoins all around the world. All right, we've had ledgers inside banks for a long, long time. The crazy thing about the blockchain is that it is a ledger that is accurate, that is constantly updated, that appears to be unhackable and immutable, and is not owned by anybody, not controlled by anybody, and apparently not controllable by anybody. So even if the central bankers of the world decided they wanted to take that thing over, it would be really, really hard, probably impossible for them to do that. Okay. This is weird. We have not seen this kind of thing before in the history of the world. Satoshi Nakamoto, which is a pseudonym for we don't know who, wrote the paper outlining this possibility in 2008. This whole world is less than a decade old. So you bring up this great question. Where on earth is this taking us? And when Erik and I went around and talked to a lot of the alpha geeks, some of the alphaist, geekiest people are convinced that it's taking us headlong into this amazing new territory where we build organizations that are A, completely distributed, and B, completely autonomous. And we stick code in those blockchains and those ledgers. We stick contracts in them. We invent new currencies. We find new ways of doing business together. And the concept of a good old-fashioned corporation that's with stable hierarchies and managers and courts of law where you iron things out, some of these people believe that stuff is all very rapidly in the rear-view mirror. I don't believe that. And you bring up the DAO, and the DAO is pretty cool. This complete DAO, intended to mimic the Tao, this mystical Asian force of nature. The DAO is this thing that was built to be the first really distributed autonomous organization. It fell flat on its face weeks after it was launched because it said, hey man, whatever happens, whatever we decide to do with this thing is cool, and you all have to abide by that. And one hacker said, okay, here's what I want to do with it. This was so poorly written, I can treat it like an ATM that continues to dispense money even after I have a zero balance. And he siphoned off about siphoned off about a third of the total currency that had been deposited in the DAO. Okay, if there's no contract, if there's no court, if we all got to play by the rules, that's a completely kosher thing to do. except that the community that built it said, no, that's actually not what we want to do, and they unilaterally revoked everything and tried to hit the reset button on it. So it kind of got us, it got me thinking that maybe these aren't as distributed and totally autonomous as we thought we were, and that it had a good old-fashioned management, just like companies have a management. My conclusion from this whole episode is that we are not in the post-organization, post-company world at all, and my bumper sticker is, hey man, you kind of got to trust somebody.
And when we worked on that part of the book, we relied on some research by Nobel Prize winners that basically talked about how much as you'd like to write a complete contract that covers every possibility and codify it in the blockchain or a piece of paper or wherever, the reality is that most contracts, all contracts, are at some level incomplete. And there's a whole set of literature on that. And because contracts are incomplete, that's one of the main reasons we have organizations and companies and ownership of assets to say what happens when the contract isn't fully specified. And that's why we have courts. And we don't see that a technology is going to resolve that fact of nature that we can't anticipate all possibilities in advance, like the fact that this technology could be used to create a de facto ATM. And in general, we try in this paper, in this book, to draw on those kinds of insights to kind of battle test some of the amazing technologies that are being described and some of the very strong claims. Let me briefly touch on your second one. I know there's other people with questions, so I'll be quick.
I think we're low on time.
Okay, so I'll very quickly say about artificial general intelligence. So what is that? Well, you've heard of artificial intelligence. Most artificial intelligence is narrow. It's very good at a particular thing. That Alphago system that's superhuman in playing Go, it can't play checkers or chess or tic-tac-toe or talk to you in Chinese. And there are other systems that have other very narrow vertical capabilities. One of the things that researchers are working on is so-called artificial general intelligence, that like humans, if it can speak Chinese, it also knows a little bit about what restaurant to eat in and all the other things that you'd expect a good Chinese speaker to know. That doesn't exist yet. And it's not likely to exist anytime soon. Nobody knows for sure because the inventions, the breakthroughs haven't happened yet. I think it's great that there are some people working on what's going to happen to society if and when we get artificial and general intelligence. There may be some profound implications for the economy, for security, for the military. That's not what we mostly work on. What we work on is what we can do with the technologies that are available right now. I think there's an amazing challenge and opportunity that's happening to the economy. There are hundreds of millions, maybe billions of jobs, as Mark's question raised earlier, that are being transformed. And that's just from plain old narrow artificial intelligence. It's amazing enough, and that's been more of our focus, but there's a whole other set of people who are working on that. Who knows how far in the future scenario of artificial general intelligence.
So do we have time for one more question? Yeah. Okay,
so,
in the corner.
Very quickly, you talked about removing bias from the process, getting into normative issues. I mean, 2,000 plus years, Greek philosophers, we've tried to figure out what's right and wrong, right? What systems we should set up. How's it going to be defined? Is it going to be defined by the majority in your model or by the minority? Will it be a Plato's Republic where, 5 decide, following up on the last two questions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we're going to be making those decisions in the future substantially differently than we've been making them up until now. So we kind of muddle through. We have companies that have decision rights. We give decision rights to organizations. We have a government and laws that overlay things. We have public discourse about all these things. I don't think any of that's going to change substantially.
If we cede to the machines, will they make the decisions for us? That was the real question.
No. Well, if we do that, we're idiots, right? Machines and the tools that we create and the societies that we create should reflect our value. If we outsource the value definition and value implementation to the machines, then shame on us, and we should have to live with the nonsense that ensues from that. That's getting it categorically backward.
This is one of the most important lessons that we've taken away from our research in this area. Machines are great at answering questions. Pablo Picasso once said, hey, computers are useless. All they do is give you answers. And that underscores that machines are great at doing that, but there's a more important thing, which is asking the right questions and deciding what our values are, where we want to focus. Not only I think our value is going to continue to be important, But I would double down on what Andy said, and I think values are going to become more and more important going forward, because as we get these more powerful tools, the most powerful tools we've ever had in history, well, what does that mean? It means we have more power to shape the planet, to change the world than we ever had before. That means that what we decide to do is more important than ever before. When you don't have very powerful tools, it doesn't really matter what you want to do because you can't do much. Now we can do amazing things. We can cook the planet, we can blow things up, we can create vast prosperity. We have to think hard about what our values are. Do we want shared prosperity?
We can take care of very vulnerable populations, or we can leave them flat behind.
Do we want more
have those choices.
Yeah, and so the values question is absolutely essential. It's something we end the first book with. It's something we end the second book with. And I think your question is really key and something we need to focus on.
Okay, we have one more question.
Hi, I'm Samantha Rothman. I just have a question about neural networks, and I don't know how much you've spoken about them. And I see they're somewhat in your book, but can you talk a little bit about them and how they relate to machine learning exactly?
Yeah, very briefly, they are the core technology of modern approaches to machine learning. So most of the impressive developments that we've seen have a really, really elaborate, huge neural network somewhere at the heart of them.
You can think of artificial intelligence as the broad category. Within that is machine learning, and neural nets is a particular technique, or particularly so-called deep neural nets. They're loosely modeled on the way the human brain, the neurons connect to one another. Deep neural nets have a dozen or more layers in them, and sometimes up to 1 billion connections. And it's very hard to know what's going on inside all those connections in the black box, but they are immensely powerful at, as I said earlier, getting you from a set of inputs X to a set of outputs Y. They can fit any arbitrary function, and just in the past few years, they've gotten so big and so powerful that they can solve these many classes of problems that they've never touched before. And they're one of the reasons that Andy and I are so excited about the first word in our book here, the machine word. It's really driving a lot of the AI revolution.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you to Andy and Erik, and I might be misremembering, but I believe their book is on sale, in case you'd like to check that out.
Thank you. Thanks, Allison.